Bing. Okay, so this is quite a hard transition to take you to Blackpool and then give you the blitz on the following lecture. So it's going to be a rather different mood for today's lecture, but it's going to be a multimedia extravaganza. Oh my goodness, I'm so excited about the technology today. Okay. The big issue that we're going to be looking at today is basically, as we did with the First World War, is how transformative war was to British politics and society in the late 30s and early 1940s. The war is typically, the Second World War is typically credited for having ushered in a brave new world in Britain. The world of social democracy, the mixed economy of public and private ownership, and the creation of the central institutions of the welfare state, including, of course, a nationalised healthcare system and universal social insurance for everybody, rather than those limited numbers of workers who had it in the 20s and the 30s. So a big thing I'm going to try and do today is figure out whether the war was actually responsible for this transformation. But the first thing that we have to ask is basically, how come the working class that had once been so reviled in the 20s and 30s for being culturally debased, for being politically potentially subversive, with the organised labour movement and the general strike, and economically, shall we say, retarded, in the sense that the union movement was asking for wage claims that the government and their employers refused to countenance. So how come it that this working class, remember about 70% of the population between the wars, how come suddenly during the Second World War the very people who had been, if you like, the enemies in the 20s and 30s became seen as the bedrock of the nation during the war? Okay, it's a really huge transformation, and how that happens is something that we're going to try and address today. Now, there have basically been three answers to this type of, to these questions. And all of these arguments have profound contemporary political resonance in Britain itself. Okay? The Second World War continues to be, and the legacies of the Second World War continue to be a central point of departure for how it is that one thinks about the future of politics in contemporary Britain. So there are basically three types of answers. The first is what I characterize as the social democratic answer, which is to say that the war was a type of peaceful revolution that radicalized the British people and led to the creation of the Beveridge Report and the Labour victory in 1945 and the existence of social democracy and a welfare state down to the 1970s. And I'm going to read you the extract from one of my book by one of my childhood heroes, A.J.P. Taylor, who wrote a book on an Oxford history of Britain, I think it was, and this was the end of the book, which ends with the Second World War. In the Second World War, the British people came of age. This was a people's war. Not only were their needs considered, they themselves wanted to win. Future historians may see the war as the last struggle for the European balance of power or for the maintenance of empire. This was not how it appeared to those who lived through it. The British people had set out to destroy Hitler and National Socialism, victory at all costs. They succeeded. No English soldier who rode with the tanks into liberated Belgium or saw the German murder camps at Dachau or Buchenwald could doubt that the war had been a noble crusade. The British were the only people who went through both world wars from beginning to end. You get that? Yet they remained a peaceful and civilized people, tolerant, patient, and generous. Traditional values lost much of their force, other values took their place. Imperial greatness was on the way out, the welfare state was on the way in. The British Empire declined, the condition of the people improved. Few now sang Land of Hope and Glory, few even sang England Arise. But England had arisen all the same. Stirring stuff. Love that. So here you have the classic view that the Second World War birthed a new political system. A people's war had given way to a people's peace. In the 1970s and 1980s, a bunch of what I would describe as new right historians, that is, historians who were on the edges of the Thatcher revolution that was to unfold in Britain in the 70s and 80s, began to reinterpret the Second World War and to say that 1945 and the turn to social democracy had been a fundamental wrong turning in British history. And that, in fact, the welfare state had caused Britain's economic and global decline that Mrs. Thatcher in 1979 was going to come and restore. And so they put the responsibility for this wrong turning not on the British people, because the British people, they believed, had been hoodwinked. They had been misled by lefty intellectuals who had worked at the Ministry of Information and at the BBC and had put out many of the propaganda films that I'm going to be showing you today. So therefore, for these historians, they wanted to turn the clock back and to say, actually, if we stop history in 1939 and we started again in 1979, you have one long history of free market economics and of a liberal political economy existing in Britain. And so therefore 1945 to 79 was an aberration. And indeed, now that 1979 seems a long time, people like me who grew up in the social democratic system, my parents, grew up in the system. We all had free healthcare and free education and everything. We all felt that this was how the world was going to be forever. Now, 1945 to 1979 seems like a very small slice of historical time. Yeah? So actually, what we thought was going to be the long life of social democracy ended up being something that was actually remarkably short and truncated. Finally, the last set of historians are what I would describe as revisionists. And that is to say that they try and find a middle way. Okay, they want to say that, no, there wasn't a revolution. There were certain continuities building from the 1930s, the interest in planning, in economic management, and so forth. And that when social democracy did arrive, it remained marked by its liberal inheritance. That is to say that social democracy never really escaped what I described to you on Tuesday as the entrails of liberalism. And you see that in terms of the continuing exclusions of women, of race and of class in the institutions of the welfare state that I'll talk to you about on next week. Okay, so I'm going to run through now briefly the experience of war, but mainly I'm going to be talking to you about the political and social transformations of the war. Like the First World War, great image this, isn't it? This is of a milkman delivering milk through the rubble of London after the bombs. See, life went on as normal. Milk was still delivered even amongst the mayhem. I do miss living in the US, by the way. When I left the UK, you still had your milk delivered to your doorstep every morning. And it's one of the things I could never get used to living in the US, is that no one delivers milk to your doorstep. And your your mail arrives, in the late afternoon rather than first thing in the morning. Quite strange. Anyway, I digress, because what I really want to say is that, like the First World War, the Second World War was an imperial war. It was fought in North and East Africa, in Southeast Asia, as well, of course, as in Europe and the Pacific. 2.5 million Indian troops wore uniform in support of the British war effort. 36,000 died, 65,000 were injured. But there were also West Indian troops, several African regiments, obviously Australian and New Zealand and Canadian regiments as well. And in addition, there were 15,000 colonial merchant seamen, the so-called, what were described as Britain as the coloured seamen, okay? Seamen who were people of colour rather than where you might be going with that description. Like the First World War, it was also a very deadly war because the technologies of murder had become still more refined than in the First World War. And in fact, the scale of human catastrophe was much larger than in the First World War. It's estimated that somewhere between 50 and 70 million people died during the course of the Second World War. And probably most remarkable of all was the scale of civilian casualties in those numbers, which is often estimated to be between 40 and 50 million civilians died during the Second World War. However, the casualties in Britain and for Britain's imperial troops were far fewer than in the First World War. Okay, only 382,000 deaths in the British military. Compare that to 5.5 million for the Germans and 8 to 10 million for the Soviets. Okay, so Britain in a way gets off pretty lightly. My goodness. Who was that? Charlotte, that was remarkably fantastic. And now I've completely lost my train of thought. The other big difference was that Britain fought the Second World War not with a volunteer army, as it had tried to do in the First World War and basically failed by 1916, but from the get-go with a conscript army. And many of the things that we saw developing at the end of the First World War, we're going to see embedded in the experience of the Second World War from the very beginning. The most significant difference between the First and the Second World War for Britain was the collapse of the home and the front line. Okay? That is to say that war came home to Britain itself. Britain became a battleground in a way that it simply hadn't in the First World War. And that began really with the retreat from Dunkirk in June 1940, and then, of course, the extended Battle of Britain, the air battle between the British and German air. What's the word? No, I know it's the Luftwaffe, but what's the word for No, the word for the oh God, I'm dying here. It'll come to me. Jesus, let me just die and go home right now. Okay, so this all changes basically with Dunkirk and then the extended battle for Britain in the autumn and spring of